there is a space in between what we find in the world and what we create in it, into which we often project ourselves. And you can see it in a child. The idea of a transitional object is a very familiar idea. The teddy bear, who is both a replacement, a symbol of the mother, at the same time as something completely created and at the mercy of the child. It could also be, that is part of what religion is. It allows us a creative space to become something that's other than ourselves while still maintaining the link with ourselves.
I like that. And you're kind of not fighting with yourself, but you're seeing both sides. Hello and welcome to another episode of Big Questions of Jewish Belief with me, Rabbi Raphael Zarum. And this week I'm joined with a wonderful man, a good friend, Emeritus Professor of Psychology at Birkbeck, University of London, Professor Stephen Frosh. Hello, Stephen.
Oh, Rafi, it's lovely to be online with you.
Yes, thank you so much for coming. I'm so fascinated by the studies that you do, especially on your psychosocial studies and psychoanalysis. It's fascinating. And I've just been reading your new book, How to Be Real, which is really interesting, almost finished. And I wanted to talk to you, as always, on this subject about God, Stephen, especially since you're a psychoanalyst. It really fascinates me, this issue. I do want to get into the issues of the relationship between psychoanalysis and religion, and if God is just a father figure for people and made up and so on, but that's a side issue. I want to jump straight in with your personal stories, because you go to Muswell Hill Synagogue, and I spent many years going there as well, and we've sat next to each other in shul occasionally as well. And I wanted to ask you, for you, what's the act of prayer like? Do you feel you're speaking to God? What do you feel you're doing when you pray?
Oh, thanks, Rafi. And again, just to say, it's lovely to be talking with you. And I certainly miss you from Muswell Hill Synagogue. The conversations were definitely more inspiring than many of the services whilst you were there, which is a partial answer to your question. So I think there's lots of things I could say about the question you just asked me, which is about what I get from prayer. Firstly, a lot of the time prayer is a kind of routine thing. It's a sort of moment of identification, both with the community, because that's part of what's happening when you're actually praying, davening in shul, and also with a sort of set of rituals and histories, which have a great deal of emotional resonance for me. There are times when prayer probably doesn't amount to more than that, a kind of reaching out, and those are what you might call kind of epiphanous moments, to which something other seems to happen, a moments of occasional transportation, which certainly for me are very rare. It doesn't mean that they're not significant when they happen, they're very rare. Most of the time I think prayer is is ritual in a positive sense, that is a place of identification. And actually I was thinking about that. You sent me some sort of preliminary questions, and they were really, one of the questions there was about moments of faith, which I found very hard to answer. But the way you framed this question is much easier. About prayer. I mean, I was thinking one of the questions you ask in your preliminary, thought piece is, what's your earliest faith memory?
Yes.
And actually, I have I don't have a very good answer for that, but I do have a better answer for, in a way, earliest or most moving prayer memory, which is actually in the shul I grew up in, Stanmore. When I grew up, which was some time ago, we didn't have a particularly good chazan. But there was an occasion on Yom Kippur, in fact, when the chazan lost his voice and was replaced by a member of our community who was actually a great chazan, who had been a professional chazan and had kind of walked away from that enforced praying and exploitation that can happen to people who are really great chazan in shul. And he took over, and that had an extraordinary illuminating effect. Musically, it was very important, and I'm somebody who very engaged with appreciating music, synagogal as well as secular, but also spiritually, a moment in which something kind of clicked in relation to that Yom Kippur service. I mean, I wasn't that young, I was probably, I'm not sure now, but perhaps a young teenager when experiencing that. And it brought a kind of life and drama and seriousness into the Yom Kippur service, in which suddenly nobody was talking to each other. Everybody was kind of compelled by this unexpected event. Part, I think, of its power was this unexpected nature.
So it kind of felt special and unusual, which is ironic because in terms of, prayer, it gets so ritualized. So actually the break in that ritual was what made it special.
I think that's true. And also I think the power of feeling actually something was happening here which really has a history. This Chazanut has a particular kind of history of its own, which is a particularly Ashkenazi style Chazanut, which, I mean, it's kind of sentimental and over emotional. But at a particular moment of the Yom Kippur service, that sort of over emotionality can really take you over and make you feel like something. Well, it's about being lifted out of oneself, so you're not thinking all the time. You're inside something. And I think also, just to finish this, I mean, this also relates a bit to the psychoanalytic side of my thinking. And by the way, just on the side, I'm not a psychoanalyst, but somebody who's very involved with the psychoanalytic movement as a scholar, because I was a practicing clinical psychologist. But that was an aside. The point I was going to make, is that a lot of this has to do with a kind of identification with my father as well. And it is, again, thinking through this sort of musical moment put me in touch with my memories of going with him to the midnight Slichot services, just in the week before the Shabbat before Rosh Hashanah, or mostly Shabbat before Rosh Hashanah each year. Musical events, unusual events, and linked very much with a kind of shared appreciation of something between us. I mean, I have inherited my father's Chazanut collection. I have a whole cupboard full of records and CDs. And so there's a sort of sense there that this kind of identification with the practice of prayer also very strongly connects with a set of links, memories, nostalgias, but also straightforwardly feelings about being alongside my father as growing up. There is a thing in Freud, which perhaps we can talk about in a minute, in which he claims that God is a kind of projection of the infantile wish for protection by the father, projection into the universe of that. And I don't want to reduce it to that, but it's got something to it.
There's a lot to unpack there. I'll do the prayer side of it first. You talk about it lifts you out of yourself. That's a movement from going beyond your body. But what I want to ask and push you on is, do you feel it's going to something? Is there something out there that you're in communication with? When you had this moment, this unusual moment in Stanmore as a teenager, when it was a different chazan and it changed it, did that make it easier to understand what the prayers were about? Were the prayers more meaningful to you, that you were reflecting on repentance and your self-change, or talking to a God, or that it was, I mean, I don't want to reduce it, but like a great musical concert and wow, and amazing this man can do this and we're together? Or is there, you're talking to something? Is there an internal change that you're reaching to something out there, which we call God?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Rafi. First of all, I don't think this is just about being a musical concert.
Right.
It was about being carried by something else, which is, you can have all sorts of experiences when you go to a fine musical concert, but this was different, and it's different because of its context, which is the context of, and also Yom Kippur, a very special day of the year as well, context in which things become increasingly heightened as you go through the day. Feelings become heightened, tensions, in oneself does. A sense of belonging can do it as well. So I think I wouldn't reduce it to a musical experience, even though the musical experience was definitely part of it. Speaking from somewhere and to somewhere, it's a very good way of thinking about it, really. I'm not sure that I do have a really strong sense of speaking to someone would be the wrong term.
Right.
Some presence or being.
Although, in a way, someone is great, because Hashem Echad, someone with a capital O would be quite nice.
Yeah, I loved your comment I heard you make recently about what defines Judaism. It's the belief in up to one God.
Yes,
I thought that was a wonderful, brilliant definition. Anyway, so yeah, it's not like something reciprocal might be happening in the sense of a communication which in some way comes back to you from somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's something more like, I want to say, so it's a kind of coming to terms with something in myself, if I'm going to talk about it personally, which is momentary as well. It's not something which is ever finalized. It's a kind of processual, I could put it that way. That is, a process is going on of being taken outside the usual concerns and even ways of thinking and feeling, and particularly perhaps taken outside a kind of critical consciousness, which I'm very much inside. I am certainly an academic and perhaps an intellectual, and that means always working, or
Yes.
thinking, okay, do I trust this? What do I think? Do I, what's the context for this? What's this person saying? What's this event doing? This, all that's going on. And there are moments when that intellectual chatter ceases. And I would say that's a moment in which prayer can find a place. So it's not prayer in the sense of speaking directly to something that's outside myself, but it is nevertheless something different from the quotidian, the ordinary moments of reflection, which I'm kind of very familiar with.
It's interesting because you talk about outside yourself and less about self. So it's not focused on something particular, but it is getting away from your particularity and something wider. Maybe that's why it feels very special in that sense.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's also something quite important in all this, really, for me, and hopefully for other people as well, which is that it's also about moving away from a sense of certainty, of knowing something. I mean, there's something about, I think, spiritual experience. Again, in your previous note, you called it faith. Here, we're talking about it in relation to prayer, in which the sort of sense that you know something and that you can be confident even about that knowledge or about your views on something, confident even in your sense of identity, that the kind of precarious nature of that confidence comes into play. Because I think if nothing else, both prayer and faith are recognition that there are things outside us. It's a kind of recognition of limits. That's a better way of putting it. It's recognition of limits. That where we can place ourselves in the world is only a partial experience of what the world itself, the universe perhaps, is actually like. And it's not just a sense of being small, you get from when you look up at the night sky or something like that, which is also an important experience. The sense of being, in a way, even irrelevant in many ways. The world goes on without us, whatever mark we might want to try to make on it. And whatever mark we do make on it, it sort of fades pretty quickly for almost all of us. Not for some of our religious heroes, Abraham, Moses, Freud. But for most of us, it fades very quickly. So it's not just that, or that's part of it. It's more this sense of, I don't know, a modesty about what you can ever, in principle, know. That you run up against your limits, and prayer perhaps is an act of just trying to both acknowledge those limits and reach beyond it in a way that's not completely egocentric as well.
It's fascinating. I mean, the point you made about letting go of your critical consciousness, which I think is important for letting go, but this aspect of limits, I think, is really important, and the unknown. And it's kind of ironic because, above the ark in many synagogues is the phrase, Da lifnei mi talmed, know before you stand. You're supposed to know God. But actually, I do see it in your words, because what you're saying is, the one thing I know is that I don't know. In other words, if I let go of my knowns and there's something else, that's when I know that maybe I'm on a path to God. So I think the Da works in that way.
If I could just turn momentarily to psychoanalysis on that, there's a kind of, there's an idea in Lacanian psychoanalysis, which is a kind of obscure branch of the French psychoanalysis that nevertheless has had a huge influence. Partly, I sometimes think, because it is obscure, so anybody who can master it can feel like they really achieved
Absolutely.
something.
Well, everything I know about it is through my teacher and your friend, Rabbi Joshua Engelman.
He knows lots about it.
Yes,
Joshua knows lots about it. But anyway, but one thing that Lacan distinguishes between what he calls the different registers of experience, and there are three. Imaginary, he calls it, which is a kind of fantasy of wholeness that you can be. It's a kind of narcissistic state in which you can have everything and be everything.
Okay.
And then there's the symbolic, which is the world where we mostly live in, which is the world of communication and language, being able to put things into words, framing things. Psychoanalysis itself operates in the symbolic because it's a matter of speech. People talk and they try to understand things. And then there's something called the real, which is the capital R, which is not reality in our ordinary sense, but it's defined in a kind of negative, rather like we tend to define God, of that which stands outside the other two orders, the imaginary and the symbolic, that which can't be expressed fully in that you always lose something at that moment when the real enters into the symbolic. And so sometimes the real breaks through, something might happen, and you think, it's an event, something's happened, everything has changed. I can't necessarily articulate it, but it's changed, something has happened. But often the real just stands away from, well, once you put something into words, you've already reduced it to the symbolic, to what we can at least in principle understand. So there's a sort of area of experience which we always fail. We always fail to come up fully against and to articulate, but also to comprehend. It doesn't mean it's not there. It doesn't mean we don't have any awareness of its presence, because it does break through at times, but it does mean it can't be contained in language, for instance, in any symbolic form. And I see that as very, very related to the sort of questions of faith and God and so on. Things that some space for something which is outside what we can easily or even actually with difficulty communicate.
That's fascinating, those three levels, imaginary, symbolic, and real. And I understand the use of the word imaginary, so it's kind of made up and built around us, I see, and symbolic of language. And it's interesting that he calls these things that break in, he calls them real. Because you could argue, like, well, from a scientific point of view, they're less real. They're not measurable. You don't know if they're referring to something specific, but he calls it reality. Can you talk a little bit about that? Why does he call it real? Is it because you feel real, or you're more in touch with yourself? Because it's a great point that where religion sits and faith, that it makes it more real, because then it's like, God exists, but not as a physical existence, but as something which is real, which is a different feeling. Existence is about a measure of a kind of an understanding of a separate being, but real has a different sense. And in your book, you refer to it many times. So why does he use the word real? Can you talk a little bit more about that? That really fascinates me.
Without going into too much Lacanian obscurantism, actually, I think there's something quite simple at the root of it, which is the idea of, you might call it alienation, without necessarily its political associations that come from the use of alienation in Marxist theory, also a very important set of ideas, but not quite what I think Lacan is talking about here. So look, the imaginary, the focus there is the idea of an image, and the model is the young child who sees itself in the mirror and thinks, that's me. And the mother holds the child and points to the mirror and says, look, that's you. And of course it's not. It's an image, but it brings a kind of relief to a child who feels, they don't, nothing. There's all these bits and pieces of life flowing through it. And then this image kind of captures it. And actually, Lacan talks about it in terms of capturing. And it's a relief. And we take refuge in that sense of, that's what I am, that image of me that I can see on the outside, that other people reflect back to me, or that I imagine myself to be. That's me. But for Lacan, that's a kind of alienation from these breaking forces which constantly run through you. It is indeed a kind of defense against the intensity of that experience. And then the symbolic as well. Of course, we need to be in the symbolic. If you're not in the symbolic, you're kind of psychotic. That is, you're not obeying the rules of the world. I couldn't speak to you now. We're speaking in English. I couldn't speak to you in English if I wasn't willing to accept the constraints of the English language. And that's the symbolic. But it's also a moment of giving up something when you enter into the symbolic. I mean, Lacan identifies it with the Freudian Oedipus complex, and we can set that to one side, except for the idea that what's happening here is that the structures of the world, language, the symbol, what can be symbolized, society as a whole, it's something that we use. We use language creatively, but it also constrains us. We have to follow its rules for it to be possible for us to be language-using entities, to communicate with other people, to live in society anyway. As I say, it doesn't mean there's no agency, but it does mean we have to accept a kind of loss, that we give up something. So both those, imaginary and symbolic, are moments of a certain kind of alienation, and that's not meant to be a kind of critique. It can become that if you think, if you think you do own the world like certain of our leaders do at the moment. That's clearly something to be critiqued. But the idea that is that we might need ways of holding ourselves together. We might need ways of communicating with other people, but they are nevertheless structures of alienation which take us away from a kind of full absorption in all the possibilities of, we have to call it experience perhaps for the moment. And that's what the real is. The real is all those things that resist that kind of alienation into the imaginary and symbolic. So that's why it's real. And now, I think mystics have often written in that kind of way, and that's why Yehoshua is so interested in it. And indeed, in a book that Devorah Baum and I put together last year called Psychoanalysis, the Handbook of Psychoanalysis and Jewish Studies, Yehoshua Engelman has a lovely chapter which is precisely about mysticism and Lacanianism. So that's why it attracts a certain mind like his, which is searching for something which will leave our ordinary life kind of behind without destroying us. But the real is like that too.
I'm very interested in the concept of idolatry, fake gods and so on. And it seems that idolatry, which is always about the self, is this imaginary world Lacan's talking about, whereas the real is an attempt to say, something outside, which is not imaginary, which is a different kind of reality
I mean,
to it.
You have, I know you've got this both great knowledge of and fascination with film, which you also use very creatively in your work. There's an early book by Slavoj Žižek, in which he tries to give the idea of the real, or at least some of the threat of the real, actually, because that can also be anxiety producing, as any encounter with otherness will be, true otherness. And he does it through an analysis of Hitchcock's The Birds. He points out that the soundtrack to The Birds doesn't have music in it. It has a kind of, I don't know if you can fit this out, a kind of rubbing sound, which is the sound of the wings of the birds rubbing together. And they gradually get more and more threatening and evocative as the film goes on. And he says, look, this is the real. It's not easily translatable into any kind of language, including musical language. It's a break. It's a break in the sound. And that break is saying there's a kind of gap into which we might fall here. That gap is, and that's why I think it's, partly why Zizek thinks The Birds is a brilliant film, which of course it is, but also why it produces brilliant imagery of the real.
Yes, I never thought of it as a kind of movie to see it in that kind of way. I've always been let down by sci-fi movies because the aliens are always just things dressed up or things we can think of. And the whole point of something alien or outside of us is other. There's only one movie, I don't know if you've seen it, called Arrival. It came out a few years ago. Well, it's worth seeing because...
That was a translator in it or something.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, so it's about the inability to communicate, which I thought was fascinating. Yeah. And it reminds me of what by Sachs talks about with the mystics, where he said, the rationalist knows they exist, but they're not sure if God exists. But the mystic knows that God exists, they're not sure if they exist. And that seems to be about whether we're looking beyond, the symbolic into either the imaginary, right, which is it's all about me, I exist, right, or I'm sure of me, or actually wanting the real, which is I know that the real is out there and I need to connect to it. I'm just not sure where I fit in this. Is there any particular prayers in the book that speak to you when you're davening, which relate to this issue, or is it really just
This is quite a difficult question, of course. I mean, almost impossible, because I think it varies a lot from time to time. And as we've already been saying, I think we both have, that prayer is also very context driven too. It will depend, what the day is. So the prayer that you might say on Yom Kippur might, but anyway, and I have thoughts about this one, and I plumped for Hashkivenu actually. The Hashkivenu, the evening prayer. We say Maariv, help us lie down. I wrote it out. Help us lie down, O Lord our God, in peace, and rise up, O our King, to life. Spread over us your canopy of peace. Guard our going out and our coming in, for life and peace, for now and forever. So it's a direct appeal for care and protection at a very vulnerable moment. Of course, you're not necessarily going to bed when you say Maariv, but nevertheless, it is the evening. Dark is drawing in. You're looking for some kind of care and comfort. It's not, although there are some references to some suffering in it, it's not one of those prayers where we want to kill all our enemies in a kind of violent outburst. It's a much more contained prayer, and also a kind of plea for some kind of containment, certainly for care. It links with this idea that there's a sense of the divine as some kind of manifestation of a kind of parental care, which you could turn it around the other way and say parental care is itself an expression of something else. You could say that, particularly, I think, as somebody who's religious might well say, the act of parental care is a reproduction of divine care. Something of that sort could be said. It's one of the things we learn, perhaps, from God, I guess, might be a religious way of putting that. For me, though, it's just the appeal for a kind of canopy, which also puts you in, the canopy of peace idea.
Yes, Sukkot Shalom, yes.
Yeah, exactly. Which is Sukkot Shalom, which also puts you into the mood for the evening as well. That it's that the dark kind of calls to you, not as a place of fright, which it can obviously do, but as a place of comfort, of moving back into something. So I really like Hashkivenu.
Yeah, and you're identifying as well, in terms of the way you think about these things, that the prayers relate to our mental state directly. They're not just about us talking to God, but where we are right now. I want to come back to the issue you talked about standing next to your father, and obviously this Freudian idea of God. Can I ask you, when Freud came up with these theories, was he trying to do a rejection of religion? Was he trying to say, religion was trite, and it's really psychology's replaced that? I don't understand. I'm not, because I think it's very valuable.
Yeah, kind of. So he was a very much definitely an atheist. There's no doubt about that. We wouldn't make any claim to him for religious belief, but he was also very, very strongly identified with his connected with his Jewish identity, and he never
Right.
renounced that. Quite the opposite. In terms of religion, he did think that psychoanalysis was a kind of competitor to religion. He describes religious belief as an illusion. So, it means not that it's necessarily wrong, but that its truth or otherwise is irrelevant to it because it's founded on a wish. So for him, faith, religious belief is the manifestation of a wish. For example, in the way I was just talking, for protection, for instance, and the projection then of the figure of the father who might protect you. He was very patriarchal, so it's the father who might protect you in childhood onto the universe in the form of God. And he says, he has a discussion. There's a book of his from 1927 called The Future of an Illusion, which is about religion. He notes how important religion has been. He notes the functions that it has in making people feel reconciled to their life. But he says, but look, it has these functions, and if that's all that, if they worked, that would be great. We would be happy with religion, but actually religion has done more damage, creates more trouble, creates more pain than it's worth. And anyway, he says, it's kind of infantile, that is like a wish. And it's the job of science to replace it with the truth. So there's this sort of mix of the truth of materialism alongside an appreciation that the defensive functions of religion might well have served people, but they don't anymore. But then in his last major book, Moses and Monotheism, which was written between 1933 and 1938, so in the shadow of Nazism, and wasn't actually finished and then published until Freud had moved from Vienna to London in 1938. He lived in London the last year of his life, 1938 to 9. He addresses Judaism in a much more positive way than previously. Not in relation to belief, but he's interested in how, first of all, he's interested in monotheism and in the question of monotheism and how it arises. And he has a speculative history of it that I won't bore anybody with. But also, he's interested in the perseverance, the sustainability of Judaism over such a long period. What is it that sustains the passing down of identity and belief over generation after generation? What is it in there? And he has various thoughts about it, including one quite important one, that we keep on reworking the trauma of previous generations in our own way, in each generation. So in a sense, he's saying the same issues keep coming back, and we find ways to approach those, and we are helped by that, by the sort of practices, processes, and ideas of our cultural beliefs. In a way, he's saying that. It's broader what he says.
Is he then rejecting his earlier views, or it's something else?
No, he's not really rejecting them. He's still not. He's not religious. There's no doubt. He doesn't have any belief at all in a divinity. And indeed, one of the criticisms that have come up recently, psychoanalysis in general has become much more receptive to religion in the last many years. It's partly a product of the work of a British psychoanalyst, Donald Winnicott, who, again, isn't talking about religion, but he has this idea of illusion, not as something negative, just a wish, but as a necessary space for creativity.
Right, because I want to get personal. So you are an expert on Freud, you've read all this, you've understood it, you see the second half, but what's your reaction to it? Are you with Winnicott saying that there's a value to this one, or do you look at it differently?
I have a lot. One of my...
That's what I want to know.
Yeah, right. One of my great defenses here, and a defense of psychoanalysis as well, is that it teaches you to live with your contradictions. I have some contradictory responses to this. On the one hand, I like the rigor of the Freudian idea.
Yes.
Of its of its critical, its refusal to accept as given things which it can't find a kind of material basis for it, even though psychoanalysis itself is often it's criticized as non-scientific and untestable. Freud didn't want that, and he thinks, okay, so there's something in reality, the unconscious. For instance, he has a business about telepathy. He believed in telepathy, but he thought the explanation of telepathy was because there's something in the unconscious which links people, an unconscious to unconscious communication. So it's not mystical. It's real as a phenomenon, but its explanation is, in his mind, at least scientific, at least psychoanalytic. Okay. I like that. And I think his account of his struggle really to understand why a religious beliefs might persevere in the light of of the difficulties of religious belief, both the suffering, that kind of central religious question of theodicy, the justification of God in in the context of suffering and so on. Why do bad things happen to good people? All that, and also the violence of religion, which we continue to see today, but historically it's always been true as well. So it's a genuine set of questions for him, and he has explanations which are in relation to the ways in which we defend ourselves against reality, against our feelings and so on. And religion as a structure helps us do that, and it's important to be able to see through that to understand something which you might call truth. I like that. On the other hand, Winnicott's very interesting. So the notion there, just to be very quick about it, is that there is a space in between what we find in the world and what we create in it, into which we often project ourselves. And you can see it in a child. The idea of a transitional object is a very familiar idea. The teddy bear, who is both a replacement, a symbol of the mother, at the same time as something completely created and at the mercy of the child. So it's a real object, it's a teddy bear, but it also is something else in the child's imagination. And Winnicott said, very important not to disabuse the child of this. Eventually they give it up, but they actually need it. And art is like that. I mean, your wife is a wonderful artist, and that moment of projecting something onto a material, she works in all sorts of materials, onto the material in which it's not you anymore, but it is, of course, also you. It's an imaginative space in which you can occupy. And some of the recent writers about psychoanalysis and religion have seen, a lot of people are thinking about creativity in this way, but some people have seen religion in this way as well. Religious belief as a kind of in-between space, which, it's not me, but it's not me either. It's something that I'm participating in, and yet it's imaginative and it's creative and it's fictional in important ways, but it's also real, because it is a genuine space. And I think there is something to be said for that. Now, it could just be that we need to be sympathetic to people who feel that, or everybody needs to be, and not reduce it to a kind of childish wish. And that's fine. I think that most psychoanalysts would agree with that. There's some sympathy. It could also be that is part of what religion is. It allows us a creative space to become something that's other than ourselves while still maintaining the link with ourselves.
I like that. And you're kind of not fighting with yourself, but you're seeing both sides. You like the Freudian approach and the rigor of it. And yet you see through Winnicott's possibility that actually what might be religion as illusion is actually a pathway to something greater.
Yeah.
And what's interesting, especially with Freud as well, with that perseverance, you standing next to your father in shul, our parents, when they're older and we're younger, stand for life before us, the bigger world. So, on one hand, up is God, but back in time is, history and something bigger than us. And the Jewish people, this is Buber's way of understanding how Jews look at, there's two kinds of faith, he writes a book called Two Kinds of Faith, where for Christians, it's the belief that this person existed, was the Son of God. You're supposed to kind of believe in that. Where he says for Judaism, faith was faithfulness, the trusted story of our generations for much of time. It's a very different way of looking at faith. Emunah is faithfulness, not faith in. It's about that bigger issue. And when you stand with your father, and I remember when I would stand with my father in shul as well, we feel it's something bigger that they believed in and their parents believed in, and we're part of that. And it's interesting because that's Freudian in some sense, but not as God as a replacement for the father, but actually our ancestry and our real parents and our journey does bring us outside towards a God. And therefore, in the Winnicott sense, I see it much more as that pathway. Does that make sense? Is that how you're seeing it?
Yeah, there's a lovely phrase. Oh, no, I misremember it. Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi's book on Freud. You might know him from the book Zachor, which is a great book about Jewish historiography. But there's also a very important and interesting book on Freud, which is called Freud's Moses, Judaism. I think it's called Judaism, Terminable and Interminable as a subtitle, but certainly Freud's Moses. And it's mostly about Moses and monotheism. Anyway, taking a slight swipe at the mid-20th century American critic Lionel Trilling, he describes Judaism as a trilling wire in the blood. I mean, Freud had a kind of, again, as a scientist you'll understand this, a kind of Lamarckian view of transgenerational transmission, which is something that's experienced in one generation can somehow get passed down to later generations. And that was part of his theory of the intergenerationality of trauma. And Yerushalmi links this idea of Freud's and is this sort of affiliation of Freud to the Lamarckian theory with Jewish heritage. through a process that you've just described in more personal terms. And I say, of course, this trilling wire in the blood. It's a nice way of thinking about it. Something that resonates from one generation to the next.
Right. We have to come to an end, unfortunately, but I want to end on this issue. So you said Freud originally saw then religion as bad, as causing more harm. So I want to ask, given this process we've gone through today, do we feel we want more religion out there? Would society be better with more faith because of this value, this pathway that it can be? Or that Freud side of you is more worried about the misuses of religion? And you've written about anti-Semitism and you've written about memory and distortion in so many ways. When I read your books, on one hand, I think Stephen likes this stuff. On the other hand, I think he really thinks it's a problem. So ultimately, more religion? Rabbi Sachs would say the answer to bad religion is not no religion, but good religion. Is that where you are?
Well, I mean, I think in a way, everybody would have to be a bit with that, wouldn't they? And I think, unless ever he has a way of putting things which is completely convincing. And I mean, I think, first of all, I don't think there's any doubt that religion can be dangerous. We see it in theocracies. We see it, I mean, at this particular historical moment, we're seeing it in Iran, but I'm afraid we're also seeing it in Israel through religious extremism there. And it's the imposition of faith, I think, on a whole society, irrespective of the way people find their own roots to it, that is incredibly damaging, as well as a very narrow understanding what religion could be. I mean, we've been talking a bit around belief, faith, prayer today, but of course religion's a whole set of practices, rules, norms, social legislation. And we, in Judaism, we know this very well. Many people, I think, would say, well, it doesn't really matter what I believe as long as I do. This is what Judaism is, a religion of behavior. And maybe your beliefs will follow, maybe they won't, but you never talk about it. I mean, talking about belief in God, who does that except you?
That's why we're doing it.
Nobody does that, and it doesn't matter. You can be, all that. So we know that religion is much more than just a matter of belief. Or when it's imposed, either as a structure of behavior and or a matter of belief, and with certainty. I think that's the thing that's troubling. It's the certainty of certain kinds of religious believers who know the truth and are willing to kill everybody else for it. That's so dangerous. So we do have to be really careful about that kind of religion. And I think also we see it in America as well, the kind of way in which religion is used to justify all sorts of oppressive actions. Actually, it becomes an arena in which dispute is not tolerated. It becomes a kind of authoritarian arena, which I think we absolutely need to avoid. Would it be good if there was more religious belief? I think I don't know. I don't know if it's a matter of good or bad. I think it's a matter, there are different ways. I mean, people usually say, it's the old kind of Dostoevskian thing as well, isn't it? If God is dead, then and also Nietzsche's, but if God is dead, I can do what I want. Well, no, actually, the opposite is true. If God is dead, then we are really responsible for making sure that we behave ethically, because otherwise there's nothing to save us. So what am I saying now? I'm not saying I wouldn't defend religion either on the basis of it gives us the necessary ethics which make life together possible, and without it we're lost. I don't think that's true either. I think there's all sorts of ways of generating ethics. Perhaps what I really think is that religion needs to be an arena in which people can seek things and speak about things, debate things, and find meaning in things without being coerced by it. That's what I think.
Well, look, that's a great place to end. And look, when I talk to you, it's always complicated, but you do get to a path at the end. And I think you spoke about your faith personally, and I really appreciate that. So thank you so much, Stephen, for this episode. I'll talk to you soon. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks as always.